Some stories begin with a rescue. This one begins with a woman who thought she understood exactly who needed rescuing, and a road, a leaning porch, and an old man whittling in the last gold light of a Texas afternoon who were all about to prove her wrong. The road to Larkspur Hollow wasn't really a road at all. It was a wound of red dirt cut through dying grass, and Eleanor Voss walked it with blistered feet and a suitcase held shut with a leather belt, because the latch had broken somewhere around the Tennessee line. She was 26 years old, and she had left everything she owned behind in a house that no longer felt like hers, in a town that no longer said her name with any kindness. It was late summer in the Texas Hill Country, 1887, the kind of season where the sun didn't so much rise as arrive, heavy and merciless, and settle over the land like something that meant to stay. The creeks had gone to cracked clay. The cattle stood in what shade they could find, ribs showing through dust-colored hide. Eleanor had been walking since before light, and her feet had long since stopped complaining in any way she could still hear over the ringing exhaustion in her own head. She had a little money sewn into the hem of her traveling dress, not much, and a name she was already trying to forget how to answer to. Mrs. Thomas Whitfield. She had practiced saying Eleanor Voss again in the dark of railway stations, the way a person practices a language they used to speak fluently as a child and have almost lost. Past the third fence post with no fence attached to it, she saw the house. It leaned. That was the first thing she noticed. The porch sagged on one side, like a shoulder giving up under a weight it had carried too long, and the paint, what remained of it, had faded to the color of old bone. But there was smoke rising thin and steady from the chimney, and after 2 days without a proper meal, smoke meant something to a woman with nothing left to lose. She almost didn't see him at first. He was sitting so still on the porch step, whittling something small and unhurried out of a piece of mesquite, that he seemed carved from the same gray wood as the railing beside him. When he looked up, his eyes were the pale blue of a winter sky, startling against a face weathered deep as a canyon wall, the kind of face that had spent 60-some years arguing with weather and mostly losing. "You lost or you running?" he asked, and there was no unkindness in it. Just the plain, unbothered curiosity of a man who had seen both kinds of travelers before and had learned not to waste breath judging either one. "A little of both, I expect," Eleanor said, and something in her voice cracked despite her best effort to keep it steady. His name was Silas Cutter, and he was 68 years old, and he had buried a wife and a son on the rise behind that leaning house. He told her all of it before she'd even set her suitcase down, the way lonely men sometimes do when a stranger finally stands still long enough to listen. Margaret had been gone 11 years, taken by a fever the same summer their boy Daniel had ridden off to chase work in Abilene and never written home again. Silas didn't know if Daniel was alive or dead, and after enough years of silence, a man stops asking the question out loud, though it never once stops asking itself inside him. He needed help, he told Eleanor plainly. Not charity, help. The kind that came with calloused hands, not sympathy. Eleanor almost laughed. She had come here to disappear, not to be needed. But there was something about the way the old man said it, plain and unadorned, that made refusal feel like a small cruelty. And so she stayed. Just for a few nights, she told herself. Just until she figured out where a woman with nothing goes next. The first morning, she woke before dawn to the sound of Silas already outside, coughing into his sleeve as he hauled water from a well that gave up less each week. She watched him from the window for a long moment, this proud old man refusing to admit that his back wouldn't bend the way it used to, that his lungs had grown tired of the dust, that the ranch was dying around him one dry season at a time. And something in her chest, something she thought had gone numb months ago, gave a small, unwelcome ache. She went out and took the second bucket from his hands before he could argue. "I don't need looking after," Silas said, gruff, though he didn't fight her for the bucket very hard. "Good," Eleanor said, "because I'm not offering that. I'm offering water. There's a difference." He looked at her a long moment, something flickering behind those pale eyes, something like respect, or maybe recognition. Then he almost smiled. Almost. The days took on a rhythm neither of them planned, but both of them needed. Eleanor mended fences with wire that bit her palms raw and learned the particular curse words a person invents fresh when a strand of barbed wire snaps back at their wrist. She learned to coax the last stubborn cow into the shade, learned which boards on the porch would hold a person's weight and which would swallow a boot whole. In the evenings, she cooked what little the pantry offered, mostly beans and cornbread and whatever Silas could still coax from a garden gone half to dust. And Silas taught her, without meaning to teach her anything at all, how a person survives a drought without losing the softness in themselves. "Land like this," he told her one evening, watching the sun bleed orange across the parched horizon. "It tests you, tries to make you hard as the ground. But hard ground don't grow nothing, Eleanor. You gotta stay soft enough to let something take root, even when everything around you says, don't bother." She didn't answer him that night. She only stared at the horizon and thought of her husband's hands and the sound a door makes when it's slammed one too many times, and the particular silence of a house where a woman has learned it's safer not to speak. There were quieter moments, too, in those first weeks, moments that mattered more than either of them realized at the time. An evening when Silas taught her to whistle for the old blue heeler dog, Rye, who'd taken to following her around the barn like she'd always belonged there. A morning when she found him standing at Margaret's grave on the rise, not speaking, just standing, and she'd turned to walk away before he called her back and told her gruffly that she didn't have to leave, that Margaret would have liked the company. A night of a sky so thick with stars that Eleanor, who had grown up believing the sky in Georgia was the whole of what stars could offer, found herself crying without entirely understanding why, and Silas, without asking, simply handed her his handkerchief and went back to whittling, giving her exactly as much silence as she needed, and not one moment more. It took 3 weeks before she told him any of it. 3 weeks of shared suppers and shared silences, of Silas humming old trail songs under his breath while he worked, of Eleanor discovering that her hands, once soft and frightened, had grown strong enough to swing an axe clean through a fence post. 3 weeks before the dam in her finally broke, sitting on that same leaning porch step where she'd first found him, the two of them watching the same sunset they'd watched a dozen times by then, comfortable in a silence that had stopped being awkward around the second week. She told him about Thomas, about the marriage that had looked from the outside like every young woman's dream, a handsome man with a good name and a house with white columns and a town full of people who tipped their hats and called him a fine, upstanding gentleman. She told him how dreams like that can rot from the inside, how a bruise can be hidden under a long sleeve for years before anyone thinks to ask why a woman flinches at raised voices, why she stopped going to church socials, why the light behind her eyes had gone quiet, the way a lamp does when the oil's running low. She told him about the night she finally left, walking out into the dark with nothing but a suitcase and a belt to hold it shut, because staying had become more dangerous than running. Silas didn't say much while she talked. He just sat there, whittling slower and slower, until the knife went still in his hands altogether. When she finished, when the words ran out and left only the sound of crickets and her own ragged breathing, he reached over, not to touch her, but to set his rough old hand flat on the step between them, close enough that she understood the gesture for what it was, a door left open, not an obligation to walk through it. "You didn't come here to save an old cowboy," he said quietly. "Truth is, girl, I think this land brought you here to save yourself. I'm just the fool lucky enough to be standing in the doorway when you finally decided to." Eleanor wept that night, not the frightened tears she'd cried alone in a locked bathroom 100 miles east, but something cleaner, something that felt like a wound finally getting air. The weeks that followed changed both of them, though neither would have admitted it plainly. Silas began sitting up a little straighter. He laughed more, a rusty, surprised sound, like a door hinge remembering it used to swing easy. Eleanor, for her part, stopped flinching at loud noises. She stopped apologizing for taking up space at the supper table. She started slowly to sing while she worked, tunes she hadn't let herself remember since she was a girl, old hymns her mother used to hum over a washboard. But peace, in a story like this one, never gets to stay uninterrupted for long. 3 weeks into October, a rider came up the red dirt road at a pace that meant trouble, and Eleanor knew, the way a body knows a storm before the sky admits to it, exactly who sat that saddle before she ever saw his face clearly. Thomas Whitfield had not come to apologize. Men like Thomas rarely do. He had come because a wife who leaves is to a man like that a debt still owed. A piece of property gone missing from an inventory he'd never once questioned. He sat his horse at the edge of the yard, immaculate even after days of hard riding, and he smiled the same smile that had once made Eleanor believe she was the luckiest woman in 3 counties. "Time to come home, Eleanor," he said, like he was offering her something generous. Silas stepped off that porch slower than his body wanted to move, every joint in him aching, but he stepped off it all the same. And he stood between Eleanor and that horse like a man twice his age, and half his aches had no business standing. "She is home," he said. Just that. 4 words, plain as the land around them. Thomas laughed, the way men like him laugh when they haven't yet understood that the ground beneath them has already shifted. He reminded Silas, whose name was on the papers back in town, whose family had money enough to make old cowboys and their tumble-down ranches disappear from a map if they proved inconvenient. And Silas, this man who had buried a wife and a son, and nearly his own failing heart on that same stretch of dirt, looked up at Thomas Whitfield with the calm, unhurried patience of a man who had already survived worse things than a rich man's threats. "Son," Silas said, "I have watched this land take everything I ever loved and give precious little back, and I'm still standing here. You are welcome to try your luck against it too. But that woman is not going back with you. Not today. Not any day I'm still breathing." It was Eleanor in the end who stepped forward, not behind Silas but beside him, and looked up at the man she had once promised her whole life to, and found to her own quiet astonishment that her hands were not shaking. "I am not property to be collected, Thomas," she said. "I am not coming back. And if you ride onto this land again, you will find that I am not the only one here willing to stand between you and what you think you're owed." Something in her voice that day, if you've ever had to find it yourself, in a doorway or a courtroom or a quiet moment when you finally decided your own life was worth defending, you know exactly what it costs to speak like that and exactly what it gives back afterward. And if this story has started to feel like more than just a story to you, this is the part of the road where I'd ask you to reach up and tap that subscribe button, because Eleanor's fight for her own life was only just beginning, and the tenderest, hardest won parts of it are still ahead of us. Thomas rode off that afternoon with nothing but his wounded pride for company, and though he sent one more letter through a lawyer in the following months, full of threats that mostly amounted to noise, he never came up that red dirt road again. Some men, once they understand a door is truly closed to them, simply go looking for another house to knock on. But the confrontation had cost Silas more than he let on. That night, his color went gray, his breathing shallow, and by the next dawn, Eleanor found him collapsed in the yard, his lips gone the color of ash. She carried him inside herself, this old man who had carried the weight of that ranch alone for a decade and had just carried the weight of her freedom besides. And she pressed cool cloths to his forehead through a fever that lasted 3 days. and she prayed, for the first time in years, actual prayer, desperate and unashamed, to whatever God still listened to women who had stopped believing anyone was listening at all. On the third night, delirious with fever, Silas gripped her wrist with a strength that startled her and said his wife's name, Margaret, over and over, like a man trying to find his way home through fog. Eleanor sat beside him until dawn, and somewhere in those long, dark hours, she understood something about love she hadn't understood before. That it isn't the absence of pain. It's choosing, again and again, to stay in the room with someone who is suffering, simply because leaving would cost more than staying ever could. He broke the fever near sunrise, and when his eyes finally cleared and found her face, still there, still holding his hand, though her own fingers had gone numb hours before, something passed between them that neither one dared name. Not yet. "You should have let an old fool go," Silas rasped, though his eyes were wet. "I've buried enough people I didn't get the chance to fight for," Eleanor said. "I wasn't about to let you be one more, not after what you did for me yesterday." "Wasn't nothing," Silas said, which was of course a lie, and they both knew it, and neither one minded the lie one bit. The recovery was not simple, and it was not fast. There were nights Eleanor sat awake, listening to the rattle in his chest, wondering if this would be the night it finally gave out for good, and mornings she woke to find he'd already dragged himself out to check the fence line, despite everything she'd said the evening before about rest. They argued about it, the way people who have started to matter to each other argue, sharp words traded across the supper table that both of them understood, underneath the noise, to be a kind of fear wearing anger's clothes. "You'll put yourself in an early grave trying to prove you don't need me," Eleanor told him once, and Silas had gone quiet a long moment before admitting, low and rough, that needing somebody again scared him a good deal more than dying did. He recovered slowly, stubbornly, the way he did everything, and the ranch, against every reasonable expectation, seemed to recover alongside him. A storm broke the drought in late September, 3 days of rain that turned the cracked earth dark and generous again, and Eleanor stood in the downpour with her arms outstretched and her face turned up to the sky, laughing the way a person laughs when they've forgotten they still know how. Silas watched her from the porch, dry under the eave, a small private smile settling into the lines of his weathered face. He had lived 68 years believing the best of his life was already behind him, buried on that rise with Margaret and their boy. He hadn't expected in the autumn of everything for the land to hand him one more reason to keep tending it. There is a particular kind of love that doesn't announce itself with fireworks. It arrives quietly, the way morning arrives, so gradually you can't point to the exact moment night became day. That was the love that grew between Eleanor and Silas, not a romance in the way the young reckon romance, but something steadier, something that looked like a woman learning to trust a man's hands again, because he'd only ever used them to build, to mend, to hold a bucket she didn't ask him to carry, to stand between her and a man who thought he owned her. Something that looked like an old man rediscovering that a house could still be a home, that laughter still had a place at his table, that a heart could keep opening even after it had spent a decade convinced it had nothing left to give. By the time the first frost silvered the hill country grass, Eleanor Voss was no longer a woman fleeing something. She was a woman who had found something on a leaning porch, beside a man who had never once asked her to be anything other than exactly who she was, wounds and all. She had come to Larkspur Hollow, believing she was there to save a lonely old cowboy from his failing land, his failing health, his solitary years. She left that summer behind, having learned the harder, truer lesson that she was the one who had been drowning. That the ranch, the drought, the old man whittling patiently on his porch step had all conspired, in the quiet way that fate sometimes does, to pull her back to shore. Silas Cutter lived another 11 years after that summer, long enough to see the well run full again, long enough to teach Eleanor everything he knew about the land and to learn, in turn, everything she knew about surviving what almost breaks you. He never did hear word of his son Daniel, though Eleanor sometimes caught him looking down the red dirt road at dusk, the way a person looks when a small, stubborn hope has never quite finished dying. She never told him it was foolish to keep looking. She understood, better than most, exactly what it means to keep a door open for someone who might never walk through it. When Silas finally passed, peacefully, in the same bed where he'd once burned with fever and gripped a stranger's wrist like a lifeline, it was Eleanor's hand he held. His last words to her were simple, the way his words had always been simple, stripped down to the plain, sturdy truth underneath them. "Thank you for staying, girl. Thank you for letting an old fool matter to somebody again." It was Eleanor who buried him on that rise, beside Margaret and the son he'd lost so long ago, and who kept the ranch standing through droughts and storms for 30 years after, because he had taught her that hard ground doesn't have to stay hard forever, not if something or someone is patient enough to help it soften. 2 years after Silas passed, a letter arrived at the ranch, postmarked from a copper town in Arizona Territory, addressed in an unfamiliar hand to Silas Cutter, Larkspur Hollow. Eleanor opened it with trembling fingers and found it was from Daniel, alive after all these years, a grown man with children of his own, writing at last to ask his father's forgiveness for the silence, never knowing the letter would arrive 2 years too late to reach him. Eleanor wrote back herself, told Daniel everything about his father's last years, about the healing that had come to that stubborn, beautiful piece of land, about the grave up on the rise waiting for a son who had finally found his way to right home. Daniel came the following spring, stood at his father's grave with his hat in his hands, the way Silas himself might have stood, and told Eleanor that whatever debt Silas thought he owed this world for the silence of an absent son, she had more than paid it in the years she'd given him instead. She used to tell the story to anyone who'd sit still long enough to hear it, out on that same porch, in that same failing light. How she'd walked up that red dirt road, certain she was the one bringing help to a broken-down old man. How she hadn't understood, not until years later, that some of us don't recognize we're drowning until someone hands us a bucket and asks us to help carry the water. How the truest rescues rarely look like rescues at all. Sometimes they look like an old cowboy on a porch step, whittling something small out of mesquite wood, simply waiting for the right person to walk up the road and finally let herself be found.